Ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to call on the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos, AO, to the lectern to give a response. Please put your hands together and welcome Arthur to the stage.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. Excuse my voice. I've probably been talking too much. What a wonderful night. There is nothing better than getting together with friends. And it's wonderful there are so many of you in this room. You know, I often finish off speeches saying we love yous all, but I've got to start with that tonight because we really do love you, and thank you very much for coming. Now, Paul, thank you for organising tonight. You are the best organiser, the best networker, the best friend to so many people in Sydney and in the business community. Give him a round of applause. Archbishop Makarios, thank you for coming here tonight. You grace us by your presence, your eminence. When the Patriarch was out here quite a few years ago, and he met John Howard, he said, "I'd never met the Prime Minister of a continent before." But you grace us by your presence, and you're a reminder of a couple of things. You're a link back through 2,000 years of church history. You're a link back to the Hellenic civilization. You're a reminder that so much of what we value today, what I call the decent, humane, universal values, have come out of that crucible of Greece. Not Greece as alone, but Greece was a place where some of these principles were first properly articulated and brought together in a coherent philosophical way. Those principles around democracy, around the sanctity of the individual, and then the role of the church. Because you go back to the original church. You know, we always have this joke about how the Catholics peeled off, a few hundred years later. Of course, the Orthodox is the genuine tradition. But the point is, you're a reminder of those values. Because when my good friend A.B. Culverhouse and our great friend, the former Prime Minister, talked about the values that bind us, those decent, humane, universal values, that's where they come from. And if there's one message I take with me to the US for this proposed role, because it hasn't been agreed yet, my friends in the US have got to agree, it is that we in the West have to be united and continue to be united in the defence of those values, particularly the sanctity of the individual and the freedom of the individual. This is the bedrock. This is why we take a stand on human rights, not just at home but abroad, because of our respect for the individual. So your presence here today is a reminder of all of that. Thank you very much for being here. Now, I could say a lot of things about John Howard. I said in my valedictory address, best boss ever, because I haven't had that many bosses. In fact, I've had you most of the time as the boss. But you were a wonderful boss, because you never asked people to do things you weren't prepared to do yourself. You led by example. And when you talk about it being a team, and being a team is very important, you led from the front, from the way you treated people as well. So for the Chief of Staff, it was easy to take the cue from that. And it was a team, and many members of that team are here tonight. It's a team we're getting together, I think, next week as well, the old Howard office. I think Tony is here somewhere, Tony Nutt, who was so fundamental to the success of the office, and so many others, senior advisors and others are here today. But it only works when it's a team. And if there's one thing I take to Washington in looking at what we do at the mission, it's to operate together as a team. One of the other things I take with me to Washington is optimism. Rank, basic, crude optimism about the future of this great country. I said in my valedictory address, this is a big country, worthy of big ambitions. And it is. In his speech conceding defeat on election night in 2007, John Howard talked about how Australia's best days were ahead of her. And we are doing well, but we can do so much better. And there's a lot more we can do, and we can talk about that. But the point is, there is so much potential here. And in going to the United States, I also take on board something that A.B. Culverhouse said in a recent speech. We were together at a security conference in Canberra. We said, you know the thing about you Australians? He says, you got to be more confident in yourselves. You've got to be more confident in yourselves. Don't be so self-deprecating. And he's right. We've got a lot to be proud of. Not in a boastful, chauvinistic, showing off sort of a way, but this is a country which has done great things. To think how Indigenous people for 40,000 years wrested a living out of this very tough environment, how they adapted to it, and how when the first settlers arrived here in this God-forsaken place at the end of the earth and actually built the civilization we've got today, and the successive waves of migrants who've come here and built this country with them. This is a tremendous achievement. We've got nothing to apologise for. We are capable of so much, and that is the challenge ahead of us. My great concern about Australia in the decade ahead is that, because people say, well, what's the government going to do next? It won the election, it's implemented its tax cuts and other promises. What's going to happen? My answer is, well, so much is going to depend on the global environment in which we're operating. This is going to overwhelm everything. And the competition between America and China is having a big impact on our options going forward. What it will do going forward is put more pressure on us to actually also build up our own strength even further. Militarily, so we can be more independent and have more options, and also economically. There's no time to spare. When we first came into government in 2013, one of the first things the Treasury said to us when we went to the briefing is that we're going to have to double the rate of productivity growth over the next few years if we are to have the same income growth as we've had over recent decades. And that challenge is still there. And it's a big challenge, and the ex-boss is right. There are a lot of things happening in economics we don't fully understand, but we know one thing. If we can keep reforming the place, we will be stronger economically and therefore stronger geopolitically and in every other way. And reform, they say these days, is hard. And they're right, it is hard. There are a lot of pressure groups. Everybody has their own modelling and analysis to put on the table. But the way you get reform hasn't changed. One of the lessons out of the Howard era is that it requires a lot of advocacy and a lot of shoe leather. You just got to get out there and keep talking to people. One of the things I admire most about John Howard and the way he conducted his government was that when we went to community functions, he wasn't looking for the people to give him a pat on the back. He was wanting people to tell him what they thought was wrong and how we might be able to fix it. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to engage and keep engaging. We can't run away from that. And that's how you'll get things done. It's old-fashioned, but it works. But it takes time. The new tax system that John Howard and Peter Costello put together took them a year, 97 to 98, to actually formulate it. Then we had to win the election, which we won by the skin of our teeth. We actually lost the popular vote, but thanks to the great marginal seat holders we had, we held on to the vote in the right places. We then had to get the thing through Parliament, which took 2 goes before we could find anybody prepared to dance with us. In the end, the Democrats were prepared to dance with us. That, of course, finished them off as a party, which was a great advertisement for reform. We then had to get the thing implemented. We had to weather the storm of 6 months, as the boss will remember, around petrol prices, because people thought we'd added to petrol prices with the GST. We had to do some repairs and maintenance there. Then we had to win the election after that to make sure the reform stuck and wasn't rolled back. That took 4 years. And then they wonder after that why we weren't coming up with another reform in 2002. We're just recovering from the last one. But it is important for us to take up the mantle of reform. And one of the things I will argue, whether it's here or in Washington or whatever, is that reform remains important. And the global rules-based order is very important to us. The order which has been the settlement for the last 70 years, ever since World War II, spearheaded, led, established by the United States. I said in my valedictory address, the lesson of the 20th century is not Versailles in 1919, which was winner takes all, which led to World War II. The lesson is 1945, when the US, in one of the greatest acts of enlightened self-interest in history, put together a new world order that embraced allies and enemies and created the environment of peace we have today. And our challenge today is to keep that order going. And the role we have to play is, I think, a bit of a bridge, helping to encourage the Chinese to be part of that global rules-based order. It's hard. There are all sorts of challenges there. There are areas where there's overreach. We have to push back. But we also have to make sure we engage them and give them a meaningful stake in the international order. My friend and colleague Josh Frydenberg the other night spoke about, with the centre of gravity of the global economy moving to Asia, we have to make our international institutions, we have to make sure they reflect that. So everybody has a stake in this order. But make no mistake, and I come back to a point I made at the beginning, that order is based on decent, humane, universal values. It's a moral order, as much as it is an economic order or anything else. It's worth fighting for because we're standing up for fundamental human principles. And if there's one thing that's animated my time in politics, and the reason why I'm a Liberal and not a member of any other party, is that fundamental belief in the importance of the individual and the importance of freedom. Now, I just want to finish on a slightly partisan note. I want to thank my parliamentary colleagues who are here tonight. They are comrades in arms. Some of them go back a fair way, like Paul Fletcher, who went into Bradfield in 2009, actually, pardon me, preceded me into the Parliament, who's been a great, rigorous thinker and an excellent cabinet minister. And it's great you're here, Paul. Thank you for your contribution. Jason's here somewhere. I don't know where he's lurking. He's probably doing a deal on the Economics Committee. My good friend Fiona Martin is here. Fiona rang me a few weeks out saying, I'm going to run for Parliament. I said, oh, that's interesting. She said, I've got a Greek background. I said, that's not immediately obvious from your name. This was all over the phone. And she said, I'm related to the Barbuduses. I said, well, that could be a liability. But Fiona, who is a child psychologist, the campaign that you ran in Reid, you worked so hard. You're still working very hard. You're going to make that seat your own. I'm so proud of what you've done and will do in the years ahead. A couple of final call-outs. Warren Mundine is here. Now, I like Warren a lot, and I worked with him on the South Coast. I was sorry he couldn't make it into the Parliament, but he is a great role model of someone who's pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He hasn't asked anybody for anything. He's just gone ahead and done it. Now, I'm not saying that everybody can necessarily replicate what Warren has done, but Warren, thank you for being what you are, and well done. To my colleagues, Vanstone and Ruddock, they're both very dear to me. Amanda was one of those cabinet ministers that you couldn't help but like, because she is a character. She is colourful. She has an opinion on everything. And in fact, there were some days on the radio, I put the radio on, I was in the Prime Minister's office in the afternoon, having gotten back from a restaurant in Canberra. And I put the radio on, and then all of a sudden she comes on, and she's giving her opinions free and easy on some subject. And then I realised she'd been at the same restaurant all afternoon and had been preparing at the restaurant for her interview. No, Amanda had some of the hardest jobs in government. When we first got in, there were issues around implementing cuts to higher education as part of the budget consolidation. And then as Immigration Minister, we had Cornelia Rao and all those issues that she had to handle. She had to make sure that the border protection policies put in place by John Howard and Philip Ruddock were actually stuck, and she did all of that. But she did it in her own, not just idiosyncratic way, but with her own humanity. Because she's always been one whose opinions are not, if you like, predictably mainstream liberal. She can go off the reservation. And she's a great, and when she does that, it's a reminder that of what John Howard always said, that this is a broad church. And you need to have that diversity of opinion and of view. So thank you, Amanda, for your service. I won't talk about your time in Rome because we'll have to talk about the dogs and what they did to those ambassadors, but that's another story. And to Philip, who I know is giving a vote of thanks, I often used to joke that when Philip passed away, we would have him stuffed and have him brought out at cabinet meetings, just so he could remind everybody of the importance to be strong on border protection. Because Philip, as a lifetime member of Amnesty International, wore a lot of opprobrium from people who should know better, because he was someone who was implementing a humane policy, ultimately a policy that was meant to save lives and to create order in our immigration program. And by creating that order, gave us the opportunity to have a strong and rising immigration program, which has underwritten a lot of our economic growth and progress these last couple of decades. So thank you for that, Philip. And my final editorial on border protection is this. Border protection is about policy. It's not a political wedge, as some people in the Labor Party still seem to think. It's a genuine policy issue. And until they wake up and realise that it's not about playing politics, it's about policy, they will never get that hoodoo off their back. And I feel that quite strongly because I was there when the Tampa happened. I was there with John Howard and Peter Reith and others. And when we heard the boat was being turned around, we didn't suddenly throw our hats in the air and say, wow, that's a great political opportunity that's just come our way. We said, well, the Australian people are not going to stand for this. They're not going to stand for the idea that a boat can just be redirected towards Australia and we will just open the door and anybody can come whichever way they like. A tough lesson? Sure, but a necessary lesson. And that's what politics is about. It's that capacity to know when to take hard decisions, that capacity to know when to be compassionate. And I believe very strongly that on balance, the Howard government always got that balance right. Now, I'm going to stop here. My final thing is to thank my family because they've stuck by me through thick and thin. Elizabeth and the kids were conscripts to politics. It's a cliche, but it's only a cliche because it's true. Our families are conscripts to politics. And I've had some tough times in politics. I've had some ups and I've had some downs, and they've been there through it all. When I got sick, Elizabeth, no sentimentality, said, right, we've got to deal with this. She made sure the family were looked after. Their lives were not defined by my illness. They got on with their lives. She looked after that, and I got on with trying to get better. And my focus every day could be just on getting better. And thank you to Stephen Brady and others who are here who visited me every day I was in hospital and made me feel there were people out there thinking of me. Now, Now, Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. And he was right. with them. The thing I held on to is that the specialist said to me, the prognosis is good, even though it meant a lot of chemo, a bone marrow transplant, all sorts of side effects and all the rest of it. But I worked my way through it, and I held on to that. The lesson I took out of that, looking around at the people I was sharing wards with or meeting there, was the great capacity of the human spirit. I saw many of what we now call quiet Australians getting on with their lives, dealing with all of this, dealing with the pressures. Now, they don't necessarily have a voice, but I can give them a voice. And so I salute all of them who've been through all of this. Some people don't make it, including some relatively young people that I knew. One of them was here on the screen, a young girl, only 23, Lauren Opie, who had a sarcoma in the tissue. I visited her over at the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse when we were giving money for machines over there, MRIs and the rest of it. I visited her at a time when there was hope things might get better, but she passed away 5 or 6 months later. So that's tough. But if you can, you hold on and you keep going and you put one foot in front of the other. So ladies and gentlemen, my final advice to you is embrace your passion, keep going forward, believe in yourself. The only jailer, the only thing that keeps us from doing what is right is in our own mind. And you have the key to that. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Fantastic to be with you in one room. I hope you have a great evening. And for those of you who managed to stumble your way to Washington, you'll know where to find us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, Pete.